As you've seen in the news, the Latvian economy is one which has gone from being celebrated as a Baltic Tiger economy to the poorest performing economy in all of Europe. What I hope to do today is to discuss how it actually got to the position that it presently finds itself in. I think the details of the crisis we're fairly familiar with. We see a country that is on its way to having some 70% of its GDP as debt. It's had to have a massive intervention in terms of using its currency reserves to prop up its peg to the euro. In fact, again, some 41% of those currency reserves have been burned up in the process of defending its peg. That's money that's not available now, of course, for developing its infrastructure that would help to build a sustainable economy. It looks like over the course of the next year we're going to continue to see a moderate decline, which will bring the total decline to the largest economic collapse in 2 to 3 years that we've seen in recent modern world economic history, along with some unemployment of roughly 20%, and perhaps most stunningly, a demographic crisis which threatens to, and I don't think that I'm engaging in too much histrionics here to suggest a euthanizing of a nation. Latvia has only 2.3 million people. Some 1.5 million of them are ethnic Latvians. They're all getting very old. They're not having kids. And those young people who have been raised, in other words, the investment that has gone into bringing them from children to adulthood, is not providing any return to the country, as those people are all leaving. As the unfortunate refrain, the joke, the black humor that we hear at the airport now is turn off the lights when the last person has left. Everyone is streaming out of the country in an effort to try and find some means of supporting themselves abroad. Now, the implications of this in terms of combating the economic policies that we see that have led to this crisis also suggest some bad news, because I don't think we'll see much of a political movement emerging to combat these policies, because we're seeing what labor sociologists just reference as the exit option. People are just voting with their feet. There was a massive protest in January of 2009 with some roughly 10,000 people that went out on the streets. I was among them. But after that, this did not gain any further traction as people just decided to get out. Of course, they're still going primarily to points west. They're in the Schengen zone, so they have the opportunity to work in the UK and Ireland, and even with their economic crises, they are willing to take very, very low-paying jobs under the worst working conditions, and of course this is better than not being exploited at all. So, how did we get to this situation? I want to provide a brief historical survey of events over the past 20 to 30 years that have led to this situation in Latvia. There are some specific dimensions to it that apply only to Latvia, and others which are more generally applicable to the former Soviet bloc generally. We see that there was this great interest that began to emerge in this small country in both West Europe and the United States as early as the 1980s. At this time, as the world was experiencing a continued economic crisis that was built up from the forces generated in the late 60s and early 70s that led to increasing commodity prices, there was this desire to find ways of bringing increasingly the raw materials, the commodities of the Soviet Union onto global markets. And this is what David Harvey, I guess, would refer to as a spatial fix to the crisis, or a kind of accumulation through dispossession. And Latvia had warm water ports in the Baltic Sea which were used to bring out these raw materials, these commodities. So you had this arbitrage taking place. You had this expansion, this growth of corruption at this time, as well-connected members of the Komsomol and in other areas of the party, especially those who were kind of at mid-levels and saw their careers stunted by lack of opportunities that were no longer available because of the slowdown in the Soviet economy and because of the hold that the gerontocracy held on power. They began looking for other avenues, other options to improve their lot. And they found them. They were very entrepreneurial. They began to take oil, colored metals, bring them onto global markets, securing them at state prices, and pocketing the difference. This was at a time when the United States, as well as the British, were beginning to develop their offshore banking structures, or I should say expanding them. And they found this quite attractive for several reasons. One, it was helping to contain and suppress oil and mineral prices, metal prices generally, through this expansion of supply. Second, the money that was being used to purchase these raw materials was then just in effect being returned to Western financial institutions, then eventually going into equity markets in the West as well. So we see the beginnings of this highly corrupt offshore infrastructure that was developing in the Baltic states, primarily in Latvia, to serve and service this trade in oil and metals. Precisely at the time that the Soviet Union collapsed, there was this desire to expand and cement in place these structures. There was an analog to the University of Chicago, or Chicago Boys, that had operated, of course, as early as '73 in Chile, in Latvia, with the Georgetown game. We saw with Georgetown University a Latvian-American economist, Juris Viksniņš, who went to Latvia, working with the State Department and USAID, and they set up a framework for a neoliberal economy that would be based on having a very strong currency, one that would attract foreign direct investment, which it never really did, attract lots of speculative capital, but nothing that really developed the real economy per se. On ideological grounds, they rejected any kind of industrial policy. The idea that you would, for instance, inventory the country's industrial machinery to see what could be reorganized into profitable enterprises was absolutely and resolutely rejected on the grounds that the market would sort all of this out. Well, the market did sort it all out. What happened was that lots of very sophisticated West European machinery that was purchased in the 1980s to modernize Soviet factories there was taken out, sold by the factory managers, and the older equipment was scrapped and sold off for its metal value. So the place was really kind of stripped clean. But what was left, again, was this financial offshore infrastructure that could facilitate the transfer of Soviet era enterprises now during the post-Soviet period, and again to move them west. Simultaneous to this, we saw that the European Union was launching its Euro project. We had the Maastricht criteria put in place in the early 1990s to